Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into medieval times, a period where people woke up every morning, looked at their surroundings, and collectively agreed, yes, this is fine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval times, death wasn't a distant concept or an uncomfortable topic politely avoided at dinner. Death was a neighbor, a very quiet neighbor, one that never moved out and occasionally resurfaced after heavy rain. Graveyards were not peaceful, fenced-off spaces meant for reflection and whispering. They were public zones, thorough affairs, social areas. If you were late for market, you cut through the cemetery. If you needed a place to meet someone privately, you met them between two graves. If you were a child looking for somewhere to play, congratulations. You were now playing tag among the deceased, and nobody thought this was odd. Burials were temporary arrangements at best. Space was limited. Bodies were plentiful. And medieval soil did not respect personal boundaries. Coffins collapsed. Rain eroded graves. Bones slowly emerged like they had unfinished business. Finding a skull after a storm wasn't a horror movie moment. It was a maintenance issue, the medieval equivalent of seeing a pothole and thinking, someone should probably deal with that. People reacted accordingly. They nudged bones aside with their feet. They stacked them near church walls. They re-airied them loosely, the way you might tidy up a blanket that slipped off the couch. No screaming, no fainting, just quiet acceptance and mild inconvenience. Churchyards doubled as meeting spaces. Business deals were discussed next to headstones. Arguments happened beside graves. Children ran around while adults negotiated prices for bread. All under the watchful gaze of several generations of skeletons who had absolutely seen worse. And somehow this didn't make medieval people morbid. It made them practical. When death is everywhere, it stops being dramatic. It becomes part of the environment, like mud, church bells, or that one neighbor who always smells faintly of sheep. Imagine growing up learning to walk while carefully avoiding grave markers. Imagine being told not to kick the skull because that belongs to someone. Imagine stepping over a femur on your way to buy vegetables and thinking, again, to a medieval person, this wasn't creepy. It was convenient. Death wasn't hidden, feared, or denied. It was present, acknowledged, and quietly tolerated, like bad weather or an unpopular tax. And perhaps that's the creepiest thing of all, when something terrifying becomes so familiar that it barely registers anymore. At some point, medieval Europe ran into a problem that modern city planners would recognize immediately. There were simply too many dead people and not enough space to put them. Graveyards filled up fast because medieval life had a habit of ending suddenly and without much warning. When space ran out, medieval society did what it always did. It improvised calmly and with unsettling confidence. The solution was the wari. Instead of expanding cemeteries endlessly, old graves were dug up, and the skeletons were removed once the flesh had done everyone the courtesy of disappearing. These bones were not discarded. They were recycled, stacked, sorted, organized. Very neatly, in fact, because nothing says respect like good bone management. Skulls were arranged in rows. Femurs were piled like firewood. Entire walls were built out of human remains. Chapels were decorated with them. Ceilings supported by them. In some places, bones were arranged into patterns and symbols just to show that, yes, this was intentional interior design. And people prayed there, not nervously, not quickly. They knelt, bowed their heads, and spoke softly, surrounded by thousands of empty eye sockets, silently attending the service. This wasn't considered morbid. It was considered practical. Bones were reminders of mortality, sure, but they were also space-saving solutions. Medieval minimalism, the truly unsettling part, is how unbothered everyone was. Children grew up attending church in rooms literally made of ancestors. Travelers visited waris the way we visit museums. Locals gave directions like turn left at the skull wall. Nobody felt the need to explain themselves. If anything, waris were comforting. They represented order. The dead weren't lost. They were organized, cataloged, watching politely from the walls. Death had a place, and that place had shelves. And of course, this wasn't hidden away. Ossuaries were often attached to churches in the center of town. You didn't stumble into them by accident. You walked in on purpose, nodded respectfully to the bones, and continued with your prayers. Imagine explaining this to a modern person. Yes, this is where we worship. Yes, those are skulls. No, we don't find it strange. Please stop screaming. To medieval people, this wasn't creepy. It was efficient. When death is everywhere, you don't hide it. You stack it neatly and move on. If living next to graves and praying beside bone walls didn't convince you medieval life had a unique relationship with fear, allow me to introduce medieval medicine, a field built on confidence, tradition, and the bold assumption that less blood is always better than more blood. Bloodletting was the medieval cure for almost everything. Fever, bloodletting, headache, bloodletting, feeling tired, sad, anxious, or mildly inconvenienced by existence. Congratulations. It was time to remove some blood. Doctors believed the body was governed by humors, and illness came from imbalance. The solution was not rest, diet, or common sense. It was opening a vein and hoping for the best. And here's the fun part. Doctors weren't always the ones doing it. Barbers handled bloodletting. The same person who trimmed your beard and shaved your head could also decide today was a good day to drain you like a leaky barrel. This was not considered alarming. It was considered efficient. Why visit two professionals when one man with a blade could handle both hair and circulatory issues? The iconic red and white barber pole still exists today. And no, it is not decorative. The red represents blood. The white represents bandages. In other words, it's a centuries-old sign that says, haircuts available, veins optional. The process itself was quick and confident. A small cut, a bowl placed beneath, blood flowing freely, while the practitioner nodded thoughtfully, as if watching the answer to life's problems drip out in real time. If you started to feel dizzy, that meant it was working. If you fainted, that meant it was really working. Bloodletting was scheduled too. Some people will bled regularly, even when healthy, just to stay balanced. Imagine booking a routine appointment to lose a portion of your vital fluids and walking out thinking, "Ah, yes, much better." Of course, results varied. Some patients recovered, others became weaker, a few died. This was considered acceptable statistical noise. Medicine was still learning. The truly unsettling part isn't the practice itself. It's the faith people placed in it. Bloodletting wasn't questioned. It wasn't debated. It was trusted. Generations accepted it because it was normal, because respected authorities endorsed it, and because everyone else was doing it. To medieval people, bleeding wasn't dangerous. Not bleeding was, and that quiet certainty that the path to health involved losing what keeps you alive might be the creepiest diagnosis of all. After medieval medicine decided that removing blood was a great idea, it naturally followed up with a second bold strategy: tasting bodily fluids. Because when you don't have microscopes, lab tests, or basic hygiene standards, the human senses become medical instruments and not the good ones. Urine was the star of medieval diagnostics. Doctors believed it carried vital information about the body's internal state. And they were absolutely right about one thing. It did carry information. Unfortunately, their method of collecting that information was intimate. A patient would arrive carrying a flask of urine, usually still warm, which was considered a helpful detail rather than a warning sign. The doctor would hold it up to the light, swirl it gently, and study its color with deep concentration. Pale meant one thing, dark meant another. Cloudy meant something else entirely. This part alone already looks unsettling to modern eyes, but medieval doctors were just getting started. Next came the smell test. A careful sniff, sometimes accompanied by a thoughtful nod. This was not a joke. Smell was a diagnostic category. A A strong odor suggested imbalance. A weak odor suggested weakness. At no point did anyone say, "Perhaps we should stop inhaling this." And then, in some cases, came the taste. Yes, doctors occasionally sampled urine. A small sip, a dab on the tongue, a quick judgment. Sweetness could indicate disease. Bitterness could indicate something else. The medieval doctor stood there, tongue slightly out, considering your internal organs like a wine critic evaluating a questionable vintage. H notes of illness, a hint of doom. Very concerning. This was considered professional. Patients trusted it. Doctors trained for it. Medical texts discussed urine flavors seriously, with no sense of irony or regret. What makes this especially unsettling is how routine it was. No one fainted. No one protested. No one asked for gloves. Urine analysis wasn't fringe medicine. It was mainstream. If your doctor didn't inspect your urine, you'd probably wonder whether they were taking you seriously. And remember, these doctors often went from tasting urine to eating lunch without washing their hands, because germ theory was still several centuries away. From politely knocking on the door of human knowledge, to medieval people, this wasn't disgusting. It was thorough. Health was something you inspected directly, personally, and sometimes with your mouth. And if that makes you uncomfortable, congratulations. You are thinking with modern standards. Medieval medicine didn't just cross boundaries. It never noticed they existed. Once medieval medicine had finished bleeding you and thoughtfully tasting your bodily fluids, it sometimes escalated to the final boss of healthcare, surgery. And if you're wondering whether medieval surgeons used anesthesia, sterilization, or pain management of any kind, the answer is a confident, historically documented no. Surgery was performed while fully awake, wide awake, painfully aware. If you were lucky, you were given alcohol. If you were unlucky, you were told to be brave. Either way, the plan was simple. Work fast and hope the patient didn't die or stop screaming, which was often interpreted as the same thing. Speed mattered more than precision. A good medieval surgeon wasn't praised for neat stitches or clean technique. He was praised for finishing quickly. Amputations were timed. Records proudly mention limbs removed in under a minute, as if this were an Olympic sport instead of a medical emergency. And remember, this happened without understanding infection. Tools were not sterilized. Hands were not washed. Surgeons moved directly from one patient to the next, sometimes still wearing yesterday's blood like a badge of experience. Germs were not feared. They were simply unknown, quietly enjoying themselves. Surgeons relied on assistants to hold patients down. Strong men, relatives, sometimes multiple people. The screaming wasn't considered a problem. It was useful feedback. Screaming meant the patient was conscious. Conscious meant alive. silence was concerning. After surgery, recovery was a gamble. Some people healed. Some developed infections so dramatic they were described in chronicles with alarming enthusiasm. If you survived, it was credited to skill, prayer, or divine mercy. If you didn't, it was fate or God's will, or something you probably deserved, depending on the mood of the day. What makes this especially unsettling is how normal it all felt. People didn't panic at the idea of surgery. They dreaded it, yes, but they accepted it. Pain was expected. Endurance was praised. Surviving agony was seen as a moral virtue, not a failure of medicine. And here's the quiet horror underneath it all. Medieval people didn't expect comfort from healthcare. They expected suffering. If treatment didn't hurt, they doubted it was doing anything. To them, pain wasn't a sign something was wrong. It was proof that something was being done. And that belief that healing must hurt lingered far longer than medieval times ever did. If medieval medicine taught people that pain was educational, medieval justice decided pain should also be public, instructional, and preferably scheduled for a convenient afternoon. Executions were not hidden away. They were advertised, announced, anticipated. In many towns, Execution Day was the closest Thinga community event. People planned around it. Crowds gathered early to secure a good view, the way you might arrive early for a parade. Vendors sold food and drinks. Children were brought along because this was considered a valuable life lesson. Parents pointed, explained, and occasionally covered eyes, not out of trauma, but because it was polite to pretend this was still a bit serious. Executions were meant to be seen. Justice only worked if it was visible. The suffering was the message. Hanging, beheading, burning. Each method carried symbolism, and spectators understood exactly what crime led to which ending. This wasn't chaos. It was a carefully curated warning system. And yes, people reacted emotionally. Sometimes they cheered. Sometimes they jeered. Sometimes they prayed. If an executioner did a poor job, and that happened more often than anyone would like, the crowd complained loudly. A clean execution was considered professional. A messy one meant the executioner might be pelted with food afterward. Medieval customer reviews were unforgiving. What makes this unsettling isn't just the violence. It's how normalized it was. People went from watching someone die to buying bread and heading home for dinner. There was no emotional decompression period. Death was a public service announcement, not a psychological event. Even criminals accepted this system. Condemned prisoners often confessed publicly, apologized to the crowd, and asked for prayers. It was part of the ritual. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew how the story ended. And perhaps the strangest part, executions were sometimes seen as morally uplifting. Watching justice carried out was thought to strengthen the community, remind people of right and wrong, and bring order to a dangerous world. Imagine explaining this to a modern audience. Yes, we bring snacks. Yes, we bring children. No, this does not traumatize them. It builds character. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. Justice wasn't quiet. It wasn't hidden. It stood on a platform and made sure you were watching. At some point, medieval society looked at crime, justice, and responsibility, and decided animals should be held fully accountable, too. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, legally. If a pig injured a child, the pig could be arrested. If rats destroyed crops, they could be summoned to court. Insects that ruined vineyards were sometimes formally accused. This was not satire. This was paperwork. Animals were brought before judges, assigned legal representation, and given sentences. Pigs were the most frequent defendants, largely because pigs were everywhere and had absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. If a pig attacked someone, it might be dressed in human clothing and executed publicly. Because clearly the issue was moral failure, not the fact that pigs are pigs, and everyone took this seriously. Court records describe trials where lawyers argued on behalf of animals with complete professionalism. A defense attorney might argue that the rats failed to appear in court because the roads were unsafe, or because cats posed a legitimate threat to their safety. This was considered a strong legal argument. Sometimes animals were excommunicated. Yes, excommunicated. Priests issued formal curses ordering pests to leave the area or face spiritual consequences. The animals, unsurprisingly, rarely complied, but the ritual itself mattered. It restored order. It showed that authority had been asserted. What makes this particularly unsettling is how calm and logical it all seemed at the time. Medieval people believed the world was governed by moral rules that applied to everyone, humans, animals, and occasionally objects. If something caused harm, it must be judged. That's it. End of discussion. No one asked whether the pig understood the charges. No one worried about intent. Responsibility was universal. If something bad happened, someone or something had to be punished publicly, so the universe could relax again. From a modern perspective, it's absurd. From a medieval one, it was comforting. The world made sense. Justice reached everywhere. Chaos was being managed. Imagine standing in a crowd watching a pig on trial and thinking, yes, this seems correct. Imagine explaining to your child that the pig is being punished because it knew better. To medieval people, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. The idea that animals might be above the law. That would have been truly unthinkable. In medieval times, sleep was not a private sacred experience. It was a group activity, a practical arrangement, a mild social experiment conducted every single night. Entire families slept in one bed, not just parents and children, sometimes grandparents too. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth mattered more than personal boundaries. Body heat was a resource, and medieval people were very efficient with resources. If you had a bed to yourself, you were either wealthy, sick, or deeply suspicious. And it didn't stop with family. If you traveled and stayed at an inn, chances were high you'd be sharing a bed with a stranger, possibly multiple strangers. Gender separation was flexible. Privacy was a concept still in development. You climbed into bed, nodded politely to the person already there, and hoped they didn't snore, itch excessively, or try to tell you their life story at midnight. This was considered normal hospitality. Inns didn't advertise private rooms because that wasn't the expectation. They advertised a bed, singular. The bed was communal. Think of it less like a hotel and more like a medieval sleep lottery. You never knew who you'd wake up next to, assuming you woke up at all and weren't eaten alive by fleas during the night. And yes, fleas were present always. They lived in the bedding, the straw mattresses, the blankets, and occasionally on you. Scratching in bed wasn't rude. It was expected. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed they were lying. Children grew up with this as their baseline. They learned early how to sleep without kicking, how to tolerate strangers' elbows, and how to accept that the warmth pressing against them might belong to someone they'd never met before and would never meet again. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Nobles slept in large chambers with servants nearby. Privacy was still limited. Someone was always watching, listening, or hovering with a candle. Solitude during sleep was rare and sometimes considered unsafe. The unsettling part isn't the closeness. It's the lack of discomfort about it. Medieval people didn't feel violated. They felt practical. Warmth mattered. Safety mattered. Personal space was negotiable. Imagine explaining modern sleep habits to a medieval person. Yes, I sleep alone. Yes, in my own room. Yes, the door is closed. They would look at you the way we look at haunted houses, with suspicion and mild concern. To medieval people, sleeping alone wasn't peaceful. It was strange. And crawling into bed beside a complete stranger, that was just good manners. When you live in a world without science as we understand it, you still need explanations. Medieval people had plenty. They just weren't comforting. Everything strange, frightening, or inconvenient had a cause, and that cause was almost never bad luck. It was demons, witches, spirits, or someone somewhere who had definitely angered God. Nightmares were not dreams. They were attacks. If you woke up sweating and terrified, that wasn't your subconscious working through stress. It was a demon testing your defenses. Sleep paralysis, in particular, was explained with impressive confidence. A witch, a spirit, or a malicious creature was believed to sit on your chest at night, crushing your breath while you lay helpless. This explanation was so widely accepted that artists painted it. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Mental illness didn't exist as a category. Strange behavior meant possession. Hearing voices meant something had moved in. Sudden personality changes meant something was trying to take control. The solution wasn't therapy or rest. It was prayer, fasting, and shouting at the problem until it left. If that failed, stronger measures followed, often involving restraints and a great deal of holy water. Illness itself was deeply moral. Getting sick wasn't just unfortunate. It suggested wrongdoing. Either you had sinned, someone else had sinned near you, or God was testing you in a way that felt suspiciously personal. Recovery meant forgiveness. Death meant lessons for everyone else. Even natural events were treated with suspicion. Sudden storms were omens. Failed crops were punishment. Birth defects were signs. Nothing happened without meaning. The universe was not random. It was judgmental, observant, and extremely invested in your daily behavior. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people believed these things. It's that the system worked psychologically, at least. Fear created order. Explanation created comfort. If something terrible happened, it wasn't chaos. It was intentional. Someone was in charge, even if that someone seemed cruel and unpredictable. And once you accept that framework, everything makes sense. You don't feel powerless. You feel watched, which to medieval people was better. Imagine trying to explain modern explanations to them. No, it's just your brain misfiring. They would stare at you, deeply concerned, and ask why your brain was allowed to do that unsupervised. To medieval people, superstition wasn't ignorance. It was structure. The world wasn't terrifying because it was unknown. It was terrifying because it was personal, and it was always paying attention. In medieval times, childbirth was not a quiet, private moment shared between a mother and a carefully trained medical team. It was a community event, loud, crowded, deeply stressful, and attended by people who were very confident despite having no real plan. Women gave birth at home, usually in their own bed, surrounded by midwives, neighbors, female relatives, and anyone else who felt vaguely qualified to offer advice. The room filled quickly, doors closed, curtains drawn. Men were sent away, not because the situation was delicate, but because this was considered women's business, and also because screaming was involved. Everyone had an opinion. One woman prayed, another gave instructions. Someone burned herbs. Someone else blamed the mother for thinking an impure thought months earlier. It was less a medical procedure and more a live-action ritual fueled by anxiety, superstition, and hope. And here's the part medieval people quietly accepted. Survival was uncertain. Childbirth was dangerous for the mother, for the child, for both. Everyone in the room knew this, which is why prayers were constant and emotional attachment was cautious. Celebrations often waited. Naming the child sometimes waited. Getting too excited too early was considered tempting fate. If something went wrong, it wasn't treated as a medical failure. It was God's will, or a test, or punishment, or something that would eventually make sense, even if it didn't feel comforting at the time. There was no rage at the system. There was resignation. The creepiest part is how routine this was. Women gave birth repeatedly, often while already exhausted, undernourished, and terrified. And then if they survived, they got up and returned to daily life astonishingly, quickly, because work didn't stop just because you'd narrowly avoided death. Midwives held enormous power. They weren't just medical helpers, they were spiritual figures. They baptized newborns in emergencies. They judged whether a birth was going well. Their words carried weight, and if something went wrong, they were sometimes blamed or worse. Imagine explaining modern childbirth to a medieval woman. You'll be alone with professionals. You'll have pain relief. You'll probably survive. She would look at you like you were telling a fairy tale and ask which saint made that possible. To medieval people, childbirth wasn't beautiful. It was dangerous. And the fact that it happened so often made it no less terrifying. It was normal. And that's what makes it unsettling. Medieval people didn't just remember the dead. They kept pieces of them, and not in a subtle, tucked away way. In a proud, well-lit, publicly displayed way. Relics were physical remains of saints. Fingers, teeth, ribs, skull fragments, drops of blood, and occasionally things that were allegedly drops of blood. These were housed in ornate containers made of gold, silver, and gemstones, because nothing elevates a severed finger quite like fine craftsmanship. Churches competed for relics. Towns argued over them. Pilgrims traveled vast distances just to see them. Owning a relic wasn't just spiritually important, it was economically valuable. More relics meant more pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more money. Holiness was good for business. And people didn't just look at relics. They kissed them, touched them, pressed them against their faces. Sometimes they were passed around like sacred souvenirs. This was not considered unhygienic. It was considered reverent. The truly unsettling part is that some saints had multiple skulls scattered across Europe, and nobody felt the need to address this inconsistency. If a church claimed to have the true skull of a saint, people believed them. If another church claimed the same thing a few hundred miles away, that was also accepted. Medieval logic was flexible when faith was involved. Relics were believed to heal illness, protect towns, and ward off disaster. If a city survived a plague, the relics got credit. If a battle was won, the relics had clearly helped. If nothing happened at all, that too was evidence of divine protection. And when relics didn't work, that was never their fault. The believer must not have been worthy. Or perhaps the saint was busy or testing you. Saints, like medieval customer service, were believed to operate on their own schedule. From a modern perspective, it's unsettling. Human remains displayed openly, crowds touching them daily. Entire belief systems built around fragments of bone. But to medieval people, relics weren't creepy. They were comforting. They made the divine tangible. They brought heaven closer. They turned death into protection. Imagine explaining to a medieval pilgrim that touching a 1,000-year-old finger might spread disease. They would stare at you in horror, not at the hygiene issue, but at your lack of faith. To them, relics weren't morbid. They were miraculous. And once again, the strange becomes normal. Medieval people did not struggle with hygiene. That implies effort. The truth is simpler and far more unsettling. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with dirt, parasites, and personal cleanliness, one that involved quiet acceptance and a lot of scratching. Bathing was rare, not because people enjoyed being dirty, but because heating water took time, fuel, and effort that could be better spent not starving. Full body baths were occasional events, sometimes seasonal, sometimes ceremonial, and sometimes avoided, because too much bathing was thought to weaken the body by opening the pores and letting illness sneak in. Cleanliness, ironically, was considered dangerous. Instead, people washed selectively, hands, face, maybe feet. Everything else was negotiable. As a result, lice were not a sign of neglect. They were a sign of being alive. Fleas lived in bedding, clothing, straw mattresses, and floor rushes. Everyone had them. Everyone scratched. Scratching openly was not rude. It was honest. If someone wasn't scratching, people assumed one of three things. They were lying, they were wealthy, or they were somehow unnatural. Fleas were such a constant presence that they barely registered as pests. They were background noise, like church bells or bad weather. Medieval humor even included flea jokes, which tells you how deeply accepted the situation was. When your jokes involve parasites, you've made peace with something. Clothing didn't help. Garments were worn constantly, rarely washed, and passed down through families. Wool trapped warmth and also trapped absolutely everything else. Fleas loved it. Lice considered it premium real estate. Changing clothes frequently wasn't a thing. Clothes were valuable, and washing them too often damaged the fabric. Beds were worse. Straw mattresses were replaced infrequently, and straw was an excellent hiding place for insects. Sleeping meant sharing warmth, not just with other people, but with entire ecosystems that became active the moment the lights went out. The unsettling part isn't that medieval people lived like this. It's that they didn't feel especially dirty. This was normal. This was baseline. The human body adapted. Expectations adjusted. Complaints were minimal because there was nothing to compare it to. Imagine telling a medieval person, "In the future, people will bathe daily and still complain." They would look at you with genuine confusion and ask what everyone was apologizing for. To medieval people, dirt wasn't a failure. It was environment, and the idea of being completely clean all the time, that would have seemed deeply suspicious. In medieval times, fire was both your best friend and your most patient enemy. You needed it to cook, to stay warm, to see after sunset, and occasionally to keep wolves from feeling confident. But at the same time, it was quietly plotting to erase your entire town while you slept. Medieval cities were built to burn. Houses were packed tightly together. Streets were narrow, and buildings were made of wood, thatch, and hope. Roofs were essentially dry grass waiting for inspiration. One stray spark could turn a neighborhood into a historical footnote by morning. And sparks were everywhere. Candles burned constantly. Hearths glowed all day. Cooking fires crackled indoors. Blacksmiths worked openly in town centers. There were no fire departments, no alarms, no organized response beyond everyone panic at once and throw water in roughly the correct direction. Fires happened often enough that people didn't react with shock. They reacted with resignation. Town records mentioned fires the way modern news mentions traffic delays. Yes, another one very unfortunate. Several homes gone. Moving on. At night, families slept knowing that a single ember escaping the hearth could ignite the straw mattress beneath them. This wasn't paranoia. It was realistic risk assessment. People banked fires carefully, covered embers with ash, said a prayer, and hoped the house would still exist in the morning. Even churches weren't safe. Stone walls helped, but wooden roofs and interiors still burned. Entire cathedrals went up in flames more than once. When this happened, it wasn't seen as incompetence. It was destiny or divine testing, or a reminder not to get too comfortable. The creepiest part is how accepted this danger was. People didn't demand safer buildings. They didn't redesign cities. They adapted emotionally. They learned to live with constant risk, the same way they lived with plague, famine, and war. Imagine explaining modern fire codes to a medieval person. Yes, we don't allow open flames inside wooden homes anymore. They would stare at you and ask how you cooked dinner without angering the laws of physics. Fire was necessary. Fire was terrifying. Fire was unavoidable. And medieval people lived their entire lives balancing that contradiction, knowing that warmth and destruction came from the same glowing source, and trusting it anyway, which is perhaps the most medieval decision of all. In medieval society, violence wasn't shocking. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't something people whispered about. It was visible, expected, and woven directly into daily life, like church bells or bad weather. Punishments were public by design. Whipping, mutilations, and executions happened where everyone could see them. Justice needed an audience. Pain was instructional. If someone broke the law, the community didn't just hear about it. They watched it happen in real time, and people brought their children. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was education. Parents believed witnessing punishment taught morality more effectively than words ever could. You didn't explain consequences. You displayed them loudly. Beyond formal punishment, everyday life was rough. Fights broke out regularly. Drunken arguments ended with knives. Domestic violence was rarely hidden or punished. A certain level of physical conflict was simply assumed to be part of human interaction. If nobody was bleeding, the situation was considered manageable. War made this worse. Soldiers passed through towns frequently. Violence followed them like a shadow. Civilians expected it. There was no illusion of safety. Strength mattered, reputation mattered, and fear was an accepted tool for maintaining order. Even children were exposed early. Corporal punishment was standard. Beatings were considered corrective, not abusive. A child who wasn't afraid of authority was thought to be poorly raised. Pain was believed to shape character. Mercy was admired in theory, but used sparingly in practice. The unsettling part isn't just how much violence there was, it's how emotionally normalized it became. People learned where to stand during punishments. They learned when to look and when not to. They developed rituals around violence that made it predictable and therefore tolerable. Imagine explaining modern sensibilities to a medieval person. Yes, we try to avoid physical punishment. They would look at you and ask how society functions without fear. To medieval people, violence wasn't chaos. It was structure. It drew boundaries. It enforced order. And it reminded everyone where they stood. The real horror isn't that medieval life was violent. It's that humans can grow accustomed to almost any level of brutality if it's consistent enough. After everything we've covered, the bones, the blood, the public suffering, the parasites, the constant danger, you might expect medieval people to have lived in a permanent state of fear, curled up, trembling, waiting for the next disaster. But that's not what happened. They adapted. That is the creepiest part of all. Medieval people woke up every day surrounded by things that would horrify us, and they felt fine. Not happy, not thrilled, just normal. This was life. This was the world as it had always been, and as far as they knew, always would be. Death didn't shock them because it was familiar. Pain didn't surprise them because it was expected. Danger didn't paralyze them because it was constant. When something is everywhere, it stops being dramatic. It becomes background noise. A skull in the graveyard wasn't terrifying. It was a reminder to watch where you stepped. Bloodletting wasn't frightening. It was healthcare. Sharing a bed with strangers wasn't invasive. It was practical. Fleas weren't disgusting. They were roommates who refused to pay rent. Even violence lost its emotional edge. Public punishments weren't spectacles of horror. They were lessons. Order made visible. Fear made useful. People learned when to look, when to turn away, and when to nod solemnly and go back to their chores. This wasn't because medieval people lacked empathy or imagination. It was because humans are incredibly good at normalizing the environment they're given. We build routines around danger. We tell stories to explain suffering. We develop humor, dry, dark, and quiet, to make the unbearable manageable. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because every era has its own version of normal that future generations will find disturbing. Every age tolerates things it shouldn't, because changing them feels impossible. Medieval people didn't see themselves as living in a nightmare. They saw themselves as living in reality, which raises an uncomfortable question. What are we living with right now that feels normal but won't someday? That's the lingering chill medieval history leaves behind. Not the gore, not the fear, but the realization that humans can get used to almost anything, even horror. A medieval royal banquet was not a meal. It was a threat politely served on silver. When a king or queen announced a feast, the purpose was never simply to feed guests. It was to remind everyone in the room who controlled land, labor, and life itself. Long before the first course arrived, the message had already landed. Look at how much I can afford to waste. The hall itself was part of the performance. Tapestries blazed with scenes of conquest. Fires roared in hearths large enough to swallow a modern living room. Hundreds of candles turned gold thread, and polished armor into a shimmering reminder that this household did not worry about fuel shortages. Even the air smelled expensive. Smoke from roasting meat, sweet spices imported from faraway ports, and fresh bread made from refined white flour filled the space. Nothing here was accidental. The food came in waves, not courses. Roasted boar with apples, swans stitched back into their own feathers, rivers of gravy poured over trenches of bread that would be thrown away afterward. This wasn't indulgence. It was intimidation through abundance. Many guests had traveled days from estates where peasants survived on porridge and onions. Watching entire animals carved and discarded after a few bites was a sharp lesson in hierarchy. But the real weapon wasn't the food itself. It was who got what. The closer you sat to the ruler, the hotter your food arrived. Lesser nobles received colder dishes, tougher cuts, and fewer servants hovering at their elbows. The lowest ranking guests were fed last, if at all, and were expected to be grateful for it. Seating charts were studied like battlefield maps, because one place higher or lower could signal favor, disgrace, or an approaching downfall. Conversation was carefully controlled, too. Toasts praised the ruler's generosity, even as everyone understood the unspoken rule. This generosity could vanish overnight. To eat well at a royal table was to acknowledge dependence. Every bite carried a reminder that loyalty was rewarded, disobedience punished, and that power, like the banquet, flowed from the head of the table outward. In medieval courts, food was never neutral. It was a language, and at a royal banquet, it spoke fluently in dominance. If medieval royal banquets had a mascot, it would have been the peacock. Not because it tasted good. Quite the opposite. Peacock meat was notoriously tough, dry, and unimpressive, which is exactly why it appeared so often on royal tables. This was not food meant to be enjoyed. It was food meant to be seen. The peacock arrived cooked, then resurrected. After roasting, servants carefully slid the bird's skin and feathers back over the carcass, reattaching the head and arranging the tail into a full, dazzling fan. Sometimes the beak was gilded. Sometimes the eyes were replaced with gemstones. Occasionally, the bird was made to breathe fire using hidden alcohol-soaked wicks. When it was carried into the hall, conversation stopped. The point was spectacle, not dinner. Serving peacock was an announcement. I can afford to serve something so impractical that no one actually wants it. Only a ruler with absurd resources would waste time, labor, and ingredients on a dish that existed purely to impress. It required skilled cooks, patient handlers, and hunters with exclusive rights. In other words, layers of privilege stacked neatly on a platter. Swans played a similar role. Like peacocks, they were often legally protected birds, reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Eating one was less about hunger and more about entitlement. When a swan appeared on the table, guests were being reminded that even nature itself was ranked. Some people ate barley. Others ate birds that technically belonged to the crown. These animals were often presented whole, untouched, as if daring someone to carve them. And that was another test. Cutting into a ceremonial bird required confidence and rank. Hesitate, and you looked inexperienced. Cut poorly, and you embarrassed yourself in front of everyone who mattered. Even the act of slicing meat became a social performance. Of course, much of this food went uneaten. Servants hauled away plates barely touched, while peasants outside the castle walls survived on bread and ale. That contrast was not lost on anyone inside the hall. Waste was not a flaw of the banquet system. It was a feature. To modernize, serving decorative birds at dinner looks absurd. To medieval elites, it was perfectly logical. Power was about visibility. The louder, brighter, and more excessive the display, the harder it was to question who sat at the top. At a royal banquet, the peacock wasn't dinner. It was propaganda with feathers. If roasted peacocks were the opening act, sugar sculptures were a grand illusion. In the medieval world, sugar was not a casual ingredient. It was expensive, imported, and treated more like a luxury spice than a sweetener. Most people would never taste it in their lifetime. So when entire sculptures made of sugar appeared at a royal banquet, the message was unmistakable. This household bends global trade to its will. These creations, known as subtleties, were not desserts in the modern sense. They were edible statues engineered by specialists who understood sugar like alchemists. Heated, poured, molded, painted, and reinforced. Sugar could become castles, saints, ships, dragons, or coats of arms. Some subtleties recreated famous battles. Others depicted the ruler seated on a throne, calmly dominating their enemies in confectionery form. It was subtle only in name. Placed between courses, these sculptures acted as pauses in the meal. Guests didn't eat them right away. They stared, admired, applauded. Sugar was dyed in vivid colors, often brighter than anything else in the room. Gold leaf was sometimes added, because if you are already eating imported sweetness, you might as well eat actual gold, too. The symbolism was layered. Sugar came from far-off plantations and trade routes, often passing through multiple kingdoms before reaching the table. Displaying it in excess was proof of international reach and financial muscle. Turning it into art showed control not just over resources, but over time and expertise. Skilled sugar workers were rare and expensive. Hiring them was a political choice. Eventually, the sculptures were broken apart and distributed, usually starting with the most important guests. This was not generosity. It was ritualized favoritism. Receiving a piece of sugar sculpture was a reminder of one's place in the hierarchy. Some guests ate their portion carefully, as if afraid to waste a single grain. Others barely touched it, knowing they could afford not to care. And once again, the irony was obvious. Outside the palace, sugar was medicine, if it existed at all. Inside, it was molded into disposable monuments. Entire artworks were consumed, shattered, or swept away before the next course arrived. In medieval royal banquets, sugar was never about sweetness. It was about scarcity, distance, and control. These sculptures didn't exist to satisfy hunger. They existed to prove that the ruler could afford to turn the rarest substance in Europe into something temporary. Edible power tastes better when it disappears. A medieval royal banquet was designed to wear you down. This was not an accident. Courses kept coming long after hunger had disappeared, replaced by discomfort, fatigue, and quiet desperation. The sheer length of the meal was part of the power play. If the ruler could afford to eat for hours, everyone else was expected to endure it. There was no neat progression from appetizer to dessert. Food arrived in overwhelming waves. Meat followed meat. Fish appeared after game. Sweet dishes interrupted savory ones with no warning. Just as guests thought the feast might be ending, another procession of platters entered the hall. The point was excess so extreme that restraint became impossible. This endless flow served a psychological purpose. Tired guests made mistakes. Overwhelmed guests became sluggish, sloppy, and less guarded. Wine and ale flowed freely, loosening tongues and dulling caution. A long banquet was a perfect setting for extracting information, observing rival behavior, and watching who lost composure under pressure. Power did not just sit at the head of the table. It watched. There was also an element of forced participation. Leaving early could be interpreted as insult. Refusing food looked suspicious. Eating too eagerly suggested insecurity. Even digestion became political. A successful courtier mastered the art of appearing impressed without appearing desperate, full without appearing weak, grateful without appearing dependent. Servants reinforced this endurance test. Plates were cleared quickly, often before guests were finished, signaling that hesitation would not be accommodated. The next dish arrived, whether you wanted it or not. Napkins grew greasy. Hands grew sore from cutting dense meat. The body's limits were quietly tested alongside loyalty. And then there was the contrast. While nobles struggled through course after course, entire meals were discarded untouched. Trenches soaked with gravy were thrown away or given to servants. Bones piled high. Waste accumulated deliberately, a visible reminder that abundance here had no ceiling. By the time the later courses arrived, conversation dulled, jaws ocked, stomachs protested. This was when political seating mattered most. Those closest to the ruler received lighter, finer dishes and better wine. Those farther away faced heavier food and fewer servants. Even discomfort was distributed by rank. In modern terms, a medieval royal banquet was a marathon with no finish line. Surviving it gracefully required training, discipline, and a strong understanding of court politics. Collapse was not physical alone. It was reputational. The feast did not end when the food stopped. It ended when the ruler decided everyone had endured enough. At a medieval royal banquet, the most important document in the room was not a treaty or a proclamation. It was the seating plan. Where you sat mattered more than what you ate, and everyone knew it. A single chair placed a few feet closer or farther from the ruler could announce favor, warning, or quiet disgrace without a word being spoken. The head table was sacred space. The ruler sat at the center, flanked by those deemed most valuable at that moment. This was not always the highest-ranking nobles. It was the most useful ones. A powerful ally, a recently forgiven rival, or a visiting ambassador might suddenly find themselves promoted to a seat of honor. Everyone noticed. Everyone took notes. Distance was symbolic. The closer you were to the ruler, the more visible you became. You were seen eating, speaking, laughing. This visibility signaled trust. Those placed farther away faded into the crowd, physically and politically. At the far end of the hall, guests were technically present, but functionally irrelevant. Their food arrived late, cold, or already picked over. Their conversations went unheard. Seating also controlled who interacted with whom. Rivals could be separated, potential allies placed side by side. A troublesome noble might be wedged between dull companions to limit conversation. These arrangements were intentional and often cruel in their precision. No one needed to announce who was rising or falling. The furniture did the talking. Even the angle of the chair mattered. Being placed sideways to the ruler reduced eye contact. Sitting with your back partially turned suggested exclusion. Sitting directly across could be read as confrontation or challenge. Guests learned to interpret these nuances the way modern people read emails for tone. Moving during the banquet was dangerous. Standing uninvited or swapping seats risked offense. Even asking to change places could imply dissatisfaction, which courts never tolerated. You sat where you were placed and made the best of it. Of course, everyone pretended not to care. Offended nobles smiled tightly. Favored guests acted modest. But beneath the surface, seating decisions were dissected and remembered long after the dishes were cleared. A royal banquet did not require insults shouted across the table. It relied on quieter humiliations. Chairs were assigned. Messages were sent. Reputations